Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence and consequential dynamics, it's hard to keep track. We're going to focus on flash floods again, something I've been dealing with as a reporter for an awful long time. A lot of the focus of my friends in the climate world has been on climate change as a component, and certainly a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, et cetera, et cetera. But when you compare that dynamic to what's happening or not happening on the ground in places that are vulnerable to flooding, it's not even close yet in terms of what actually determines if people die or if structures get destroyed. The dynamics on the ground are creating the exposure and vulnerability, particularly, are what determine when a heavy rain becomes a flood and then becomes a disaster. And I've got at least two and maybe three people coming on. One from Indonesia, who hopefully she'll navigate the links and come here from the opposite side of the world. Nasheen Matani, who's been working for years to build a kind of sensory system for Indonesia, a real-time way to have data flow from experts to the world and from around like Jakarta, a giant city, from people using their phones to when they see a flood or a subway being flooded or what, to send information. So it's just a fantastic apparatus. Early on, it relied on the thing that used to be called Twitter. And I've got Jim Moffat on here, who was at that thing called Twitter when it was an active part of the flood safety ecosystem, the API, the portal through which Twitter data was available in real time, was being utilized in many cool ways, including in Texas, to rapidly get information where it needs to go to build safer communities. And Andrew Krushevitz, who is a Columbia Climate School, who has been on this webcast before, or both of you have. Oh, and here's Nasheen. Hold on.
Yay.
Nasheen,
Hi, everyone.
can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you great.
Oh, fantastic. And
Awesome.
thanks for coming on from the other side of the planet. And hopefully
Thanks for accommodating.
there might be a little echoes and stuff, but we'll just have to deal with it. I really appreciate your being part of this. Jim Moffat, when he was at Twitter, before it became a Muskville, was very enthusiastic about the experiments, not just experiments, but the actual use of Twitter data in Indonesia as a way to build community awareness and expert awareness of flooding in Jakarta, a city that's sinking rapidly and prone to terrible flooding. So it's great to have you here to talk about Peta Bencana and where things are. I wanted to start with a little clip from back in 2021 when Andrew was among the experts I was connecting with about flash flooding, because I want to make sure the audience understands that this isn't just about rural Texas, that there are issues anywhere rain can fall at more than 3 inches an hour, basically. Maybe, I don't know, Andrew, if that feels roughly right. You're going to have flash flooding because and if you have an impervious surface like in a city, it's unbelievable. So hold on a second, everyone, and let's just get into an unbelievably sobering experience that part of the tragedy that unfolded in New York City and around New York City in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems so utterly non-21st century to think in a world with satellites and buzzing phones and so much knowledge that we still end up with NYPD officers, as you can see here. This is one of the most wrenching scenes. It's not, this was where the couple and their toddler died underground in one of a couple 100,000 apartments that most of which are illegally converted to habitation because of a housing crunch in New York City that's been decades long. And so if you're an immigrant, if you're low income, your choices are pretty constrained, and in this case, so sadly constrained that they perished. They were among the 50 or so people in the New York region, New Jersey, those caught in cars, those in subterranean housing. And this just really feels like something we could do much more about. And that's why I have you all here tonight and today, this morning, wherever you are, to see what we can do to foster better outcomes in places like rural Texas, Jakarta, and New York City, when too much rain falls on landscapes that are not built for it and people are in harm's way. So thanks. I'd like to start by maybe having you each describe why this is an issue that you focus on. And maybe we'll start with Nasheen. You have a lot of technology capacity. You could work on all kinds of problems, Nasheen. So what is it about the flooding issue that draw you in? And then we'll talk a little bit about what you're working on.
I think what drew me in is that it's personal. We grew up in the flooding. I grew up in Jakarta, and flooding is something that we experienced every year. And historically, there was what we called a 5-year flood, there was a major flood every 5 years. But as I was growing up throughout high school, that 5-year flood was happening every single year. It wasn't 5 years anymore, and it was getting increasingly severe. And I remember in my house at that time, we could see the water stain on the wall, and it's really hard to get rid of, and it would be rising every year. So this was an issue that it was just getting worse. And as a resident, it was something that deeply affected me, my community, everyone I knew. And I think that was the main draw. We need to do something about it. We're living here.
And did you study the technology side of things? Did you come from sort of the computer world, or?
No, actually, I'm trained as an architect.
Interesting.
So I had no formal training for any technology or any computation. I came into this, and I think, to me, this platform is architecture, because I see architecture as the organization of people in space. You can do that through bricks and mortar and urban planning, but you can also do that increasingly now through software. I mean, software tells you who to date, where to eat, and so why not how to coordinate during disasters? And I think I definitely think the architectural background has directly influenced how I approach and come to the work.
Well, it's been great to listen to and understand. Again, Jim Moffat sort of pointed me to your work there, and it's really interesting. Can you describe a little bit how the system has worked?
Yeah, so one of the things we realized when we were starting the work was that, a lot of people would say that there's not enough data in a city like Jakarta. And people say that often because there may not be sets of formal data, that's the type of data that we're typically accustomed to look for. But the fact is that at the time, Jakarta was the Twitter capital of the world, generating 2% of the world's tweets daily. And people were actively posting on social media during disasters. And it's not just on Twitter, of course, it's on all social media platforms. And so that represents an extremely valuable data set to tap into, because all of those posts that people are sharing are geotagged and timestamped, which is incredibly location-specific contextual detail that is extremely important during a disaster. So the challenge is not that there's that there's a lack of data. The challenge is that there's too much of it. How do we filter and sort through it quickly enough if we want to make that a useful data source that people can actually use to make decisions? And so our software plugs into existing social media channels, and it started with Twitter, but has since expanded to other channels. It detects keywords like flood or fire or earthquake, and when the software detects that word, a bot will automatically reply to the user saying, hey, are you really in a disaster? And would you like to submit a report? And so if the user responds, we guide them through a few simple steps to submit a report, which includes confirming their location, adding some detail like photo and description. And within seconds, that detail is used to create a report and map disasters in real time. And that's what is displayed on Peta Bencana, which means disaster map. So when you open the map, it's a live map of reports that have been submitted by people, and people are using that to, navigate safely personally, but then also to coordinate efforts for response in their own communities. And it's also integrated into national level of government, who's using it to monitor resident reports and respond to their needs. They say it's the fastest information source we have. And so, I think we all see that in any situation, typically, everyone turns to social media, and like everyone is so quick to post on social media. And how do we harness that actually for situations like this where real-time information is so incredibly important?
Yeah, and I'm showing a still image. Oh, and sorry about the echo. I'm not sure. Maybe if each of you can mute yourself just when
Yeah.
you're not talking, that might help. But I'm showing a still from one of your videos that shows that taking selfies, even the things we're all doing anyway,
Yeah.
is information that can be utilized by these systems.
Yeah, I mean, we have a saying that selfies save lives, because a selfie is incredibly important information. A person in a flood is a flood height estimate. Like, you can see there, you can estimate how deep the water is through that photo. And it's really amazing sometimes looking through the photo archives we receive. There are lots of selfies that people take in the flood. Yeah, like this one.
Right.
There is sort of, I think it may stem from the fact that every year we experience this, we're used to it. It's not to say the situation is not dire and unfair, and there are a lot of unequal aspects, but we try and, encourage this community spirit that when there is a disaster, there are things that we can still do to help each other. And I think we see that actually all over the world, is when there's a disaster, people are so incredibly strong in coming together and supporting each other.
Right. That's great. So Jim, I want to get to the Twitter end of this in a minute, but I'd like to get Andrew in here. Andrew, you've done tons of work around the world in trying to facilitate the capacity to have flash flood warnings, particularly that can get ahead of the problem. So had you been familiar with some of this stuff or already? Maybe an answer there, and then just weigh in a little bit on your background and why this is an issue that fixates you so much.
Yes. I haven't been I'm not familiar at this level of detail. So thank you for sharing this work. Like, I've heard of different examples of using this type of technology, but no, I personally have not been involved in something like this. So yeah, thank you for sharing. And my background is in meteorology. So I am interested, I work on forecasting and risk assessment of extreme hydrometeorological events. And yeah, flash floods have always been one of the types of disasters that I've been very interested in. And yeah, going back to something you said, Andy, about the 3 inch an hour, it's not exactly the best way to frame it, I suggest. I mean, there's areas where far less rainfall can lead to some type of flash flood, right? I mean, flash floods could actually be broken down further into subtypes. And usually what I say is, I don't know, anywhere that gets any amount of rainfall is at non-zero risk to flash floods. And it's a bit of a stretch, but still basically saying if it rains where you are, you're in an area that's has some level of risk of flash floods. And I think that's really important when we're talking about risk. There are certain areas that, yeah, you're just not going to be at any level of risk to a certain type of a disaster, or even a certain type of flood. For example, I mean, coastal flooding or storm surge flooding, once you move a certain distance inland, you will be essentially or actually at zero level of coastal flood risk, right? Same thing with the river. Once you move a certain distance from the river, you could eliminate effectively the risk of riverine flooding. But flash floods are very different. Pretty much every place that sees rainfall, which is most of where we live, there's some level of flash flood. So I've been fascinated by that, by disaggregating risk by flood type, but then taking it further, breaking it down further to subtypes of flash floods. There's many types of flash floods as well, and why is that important? Well, certain types of flash floods, like the ones we saw in Texas, are driven perhaps more by the extreme precipitation element. But then there's other types of flash floods, for example, in New York City, that certainly you need a certain level of extreme precipitation, but the socioeconomic factors, the land cover, the imperviousness perhaps could be even more important if we're talking about certain types of impacts like loss of life, for example. So yeah, I've been drawn to these questions, and being from an early warning or anticipatory action perspective, it is important. Flood type makes a very big difference if we're talking about which types of action should be prioritized in which communities at what lead time, and certainly we like to think that prioritization is the framing. If we had enough lead time, we could take action in these areas. But also what we're hearing from Texas is that, this area is part of Flash Flood Alley. It's not all of Flash Flood Alley. It's part of what they call a Flash Flood Alley. So an area that has a high level of baseline risk of flash floods. So if we're talking about dealing or living with flash flood risk in places like that, there's a sense that, if it's just an average flash flood, perhaps we could deal with it, right? An average flash flood is not a good thing, but that's very different in people's minds than a 30-foot wall of water. So I think making that distinction between different magnitudes of flash floods is one of the major questions here. And yeah, in terms of issuing some of the warnings, the standard operating procedures, it seems like they were likely followed appropriately. But one of the questions should be in the retrospective analyses and research is this justification for different types of gradients, or thresholds or benchmarks or something within what we're already referring to as like an extreme flash flood or a flash flood emergency. It's one of the distinctions that we have: flash flood warning, flash flood emergency. It's meant to indicate different levels of severity and socioeconomic impact, but perhaps we have to go further. And yeah, I think that was one. That it seems like that was one of the elements here that's arising. What does it mean to just be? And I think in the picture that was shown in Indonesia, that's perhaps a level of flood that people can deal with, right? There's definitely negative consequences, but this sense of like we could deal with it as part of our experience here. I've seen this in many places that I've worked before, but then there should be different approaches when there is a short-term increase from that baseline level of risk, or the baseline level of risk of a type of flash flood, or type of any type of flood, where there's a perception that it could be dealt with. So there's a lot of like social science in here, a lot of cognitive science, but yeah, it is definitely a climate and weather challenge. But there's many ingredients, to what makes a flash flood. And there's many ingredients when we're talking about flash flood risk. So this is yet again another example in Texas that we're confronted with those dynamics.
And I'm showing a piece I did 4 years ago on one of your former colleagues, Beth Tellman, and a big team did a global analysis showing that people are moving into zones of flooding risk faster than flooding risk is changing, faster than floods are changing. The human desire to be near a river or where the commerce is, whether you're in Indonesia or South Asia, or whether you're in the States, is still there. Florida is seeing still something like 800 people are moving to Florida every day on average, still, despite the hurricane and other threats there. So that's where the urgency factor, I guess, comes in. Let's get to Jim Moffitt. Now, Jim, remind me of your background. You're in Colorado. There have been some bad flash floods in that area of Colorado, but what pulled you into this mess, and then to social media?
Right. Well, I ended up in Colorado. I went to grad school for environmental engineering in Boulder. And through that, I was more focused on snow hydrology, but that was my introduction into remote sensors and all these different gauges that measure weather. And so my my second job out of grad school, I was the fourth employee for a flood warning software company, actually founded in Lyons, Colorado, which was one of the hot spots for our big flood, in 2013. So I became a software engineer there and worked there for 13 years, working on building what we call base station software. It's the software that receives all the real-time reports from the field. And you build that software and these systems to send out notifications. And the software lets you pick different, channels to broadcast on, different, from a text message, email, social media, whatever. But after 13 years, I was looking for something new, and I came across a startup in Boulder that at the time was a Twitter partner. So they had license to the Twitter fire hose, and we're building tools so people could pick out tweets of interest in real time, out of the 6,000 per second that were being published.
Amazing.
And really for my own education and given my flood warning background, my job was a developer advocate. So my job was to tell other developers about what you could do with Twitter data. But to do that, I had to kind of build my own projects, and I naturally focused on floods and Twitter data. While at the same time, I was wondering, why am I leaving the flood warning world to go work for basically a social media company? But I was able to blend the two and keep going in both areas. This startup I joined was then acquired by Twitter. But I first picked, 10 or 12 major events around the United States from that time, which actually is pretty early in the Twitter history, 2012, 2013. But even back then, I was correlating rain gauge data with the number of tweets, geotagged tweets coming from a certain area. And, sort of intuitive, but it definitely visually showed that people were already using Twitter in this case to broadcast real-time crowdsourced observations and photos. And so I found that pretty fascinating. To Twitter's credit, they supported me in these efforts. I started going to hydrology conferences, and that's one of my most poignant memories is people seeing my name tag and wondering, why is somebody from Twitter at this hydrology conference? But anyway, so I just advocated for that use case to let the folks, at least in the States, especially who are operating these flood warning systems, to impress upon them that you're in the business of sending notifications. Social media is this up and coming real-time service. You should consider that as one of your many channels to communicate to the public. And part of that is the listening use case, which is what Nasheen is pioneered, is that not only can you broadcast in real time to a wide area, you can listen for comments and photos and things coming in. And so that was really for me a full circle moment where, the role of, in this case, social media for communications is really has a lot of potential.
And let's get to what happened. What's lost here? You left Twitter right around the time. I can't remember how ensconced Musk was at that time, but lots of things started to change, including this free flow of data was throttled back. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, they after the purchase, after the acquisition, I survived the major layoff, but the famous fork in the road, I took the fork where I could leave the company because I'd worked with a lot of teams of engineers for at that point up to 8 years, and 95% of them were gone. So it was pretty easy decision for me. But yeah, they priced their APIs, and Nasheen can talk to this at length about how they basically, especially for the listening use case, if you wanted to pull in, 10,000 tweets looking for those 50 that have relevance to your event, they just made it incredibly expensive. I don't know what the price tag ended up, but it was, if I remember right, they wanted more in an annual fee than your operating budget. I mean, it was ridiculous. Like a enterprise level subscription, literally many thousands of dollars per month. So a lot of agencies just, simply couldn't afford that.
Sure. I'm showing the U.S. Geological Survey Texas Flood Watch account still exists, but it says this is an archived account and is not being updated. The data are still there. You and I were talking about this.
Yeah.
But,
it hasn't updated since September of 23.
And this is the whole thing. The data are there, just as Nasheen said in Jakarta. Andrew, all around the world, you can know when the rain is falling. But if it's not reaching communities at risk in ways that they can respond to, then it's all wasted. Yeah. And that also that idea of the communities, the sort of flow of data, the listening part. Think about the applications for that, and for Twitter to feel like they had to monetize all of that, not create at least a portal for NGOs, and non-governmental things, or for humanitarian agencies to use the data. Seems so stupid.
Yeah,
frankly. Nasheen, could you talk a little bit about how that played out for you in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think the other thing to combine with that was the time factor and the recklessness that we see these decisions being made, because it was sometime around in October, and our organization had a very long relationship with Twitter because of Jim, and we had written agreements in place. And the way we found out that the service was being cut was not through any communication from their side, despite having an agreement, but it was through, I was just checking our Twitter account because we were experiencing extremely heavy rainfall. And I happened to see there was a tweet from the Twitter developer account saying that in 7 days' time, we're going to turn off the service. And so that was really alarming, because it was like, wait, does this affect me or not? Like, is this, am I an exception or not to this? But when we followed up with that, it, obviously it was going to affect us. What was really alarming was that same week, the meteorological agency had issued a warning saying that we were going to experience extremely heavy rainfall in the coming weeks, and that was going to be an extremely heavy monsoon season. And so we had 7 days notice, not formally, but through checking Twitter. And this is what was so reckless, is that 7 days for anyone using this service, and it wasn't just us, I think there were many different agencies relying on Twitter data for whether it was looking at different humanitarian use cases, or even in some cases, I think with health. To have this cut off in 7 days means we have no time to prepare. We have trained communities for years to use this service, and people have come to rely on it. How do we shift that suddenly in 7 days and say that, hey, this is not going to work anymore? So that was extremely stressful. Eventually, we did manage to reach out to them, negotiate, get a bit of an extension for that. But it was this continuous back and forth. And because everyone had left, and it was always someone new we were talking to every week, trying to negotiate, can you give us permissions just until this extreme weather passes so that we have time to transition our communities away from it, because this is a public safety issue at this point. But over time, we've also seen that the use of Twitter in Indonesia has significantly dropped. So, which is unfortunate. This was such a powerful thing to be able to reach people through Twitter. Our bot had become famous, so famous, because everyone knew about it. And it was like, oh, you guys, I see you on Twitter all the time. And it was so famous that it was on comedy shows, people we didn't know just talking about it. It's like, oh, it's that bot. But thankfully, we were able to transition to other social media. So at the same time that Twitter started to stop this service, we were able to plug into WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is the most widely used social media platform in Indonesia. And that became incredibly popular. So we were lucky in terms of timing that coincided. But yeah, it was a very stressful moment. And the price tag that they hit us with was sort of unbelievable to see when we looked at it. It was a monthly cost that was exceeded our entire operational cost for a year. And we had no way of raising that in 7 days either.
Wow. You're reminding me a little bit of the U.S. Agency for International Development being abruptly shut down. Is that in something that affects your work too?
Yeah, so we since over 8 years, our organization was founded in 2017. USAID has been our primary donor and a stable donor, increasing funding every year. So it was the same feeling, that feeling of recklessness. We felt hit with it twice. And it's like this, it's just this no time for preparation. And USAID was like a shock we didn't expect at all, because the funds were committed to us for the year, and we didn't, with all of the, it's extremely hard for a local organization like us to receive direct USAID funding. And there's so many contractual agreements and like things in place that we have to comply to. And I thought that with all of those protections in place, there are all of these legal measures. How could you take funding that you've already committed to, that's already signed off on? We knew that we should expect changes in the future, but we had no idea that they could take back funding that was committed. So that also was a moment where the ground really shook under our feet, and we're still trying to figure out and navigate our way through that.
Yeah, I'm putting on the screen. Global Press, which is an international journalism operation, has reporters in Indonesia, and they just did this piece: floods inundate Jakarta after cuts to disaster relief. I wanted to bring in Andrew on this. Andrew, again, you deal with many, many different developing countries. You deal with the Red Cross, the whole climate resilience question. Have you been tracking this same issue with the aid cutoff and sort of the changed relationship between the United States and these areas?
Well, I think we're still seeing it play out, and I hate to say that, but fortunately in many places, I mean, the systems and the capacity was built so that if funding changed, even abruptly, is that there's still enough memory to keep some of the programs going. But it's not sustainable, unfortunately, and I fear that we will start to see changes in the operational capacity of issuance of warnings, just forecasting, different meteorological elements. And then, yes, certainly in terms of anticipating, the impact. So, I mean, we need to be careful when we're talking about like attribution in terms of the impact and why it happened. I mean, there's just so many factors, with increasing precipitation events being one of them, or funding being pulled or changed is another one. So, yeah, I mean, I think we should come back in a few months and talk more about that. I think we're starting to see some examples, but yeah, I don't have any in particular to point to right now, just because things are still evolving. But it is an important question, and now's the time to set up, monitoring systems or just think about what metrics like we should use to monitor the effectiveness of early warning systems, the effectiveness of impact-based forecasting systems. I mean, these are things that to some extent there's always been an assessment of effectiveness, but we are faced. It's a critical moment where we must have those data, at the very least, to ensure that when there are limited amounts of funds available, we know how to program it. And from an early warning system perspective, in designing them and the implementation of them, it's not comfortable to think about like which elements are a must-have versus a nice-to-have, but we are likely being forced to think about that more and more, and thinking about the effectiveness or the operation in terms of what's ideal versus what's sufficient. I mean, I think that's the era that we're moving into for a variety of reasons.
So I wanted to swing back to Jim, and thank you, by the way, Andrew, on this comparison of other social media platforms, I still need to understand WhatsApp better because I don't even think of it much as a social media platform. But I know everyone I know in developing countries uses it that way all the time. Does it have the same open data value that Twitter had, Jim? And we've talked
Yeah.
about Blue Sky, and we talked about Threads, and we talked about Mastodon. Oh,
Yeah.
I had to actually think. What's that called? Oh, Mastodon.
Yeah.
How do these other things compare to what was there for Twitter? And could you cobble something? As Andrew was saying, is there a way to think creatively now with the in this moment to boost capacities where we need it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when it comes to WhatsApp, I'm not a power user at all. My daughter's currently living in New Zealand, so we use WhatsApp for phone calls. But I'm curious about how it's used in Indonesia in more of a social media, public sharing mode.
Me too.
As I indicated earlier in email, I'm not a good source for what's going on at Twitter anymore, or at X, because I haven't been on X for months, and I can't even log in anymore. So I've been looking at other social media networks, Blue Sky and Threads, that are, in terms of how they look and feel, are a lot like Twitter. Mm-hmm. It all comes down to those APIs, and I have to believe that the alternatives do have now APIs that are quite functional for automating, broadcasting, for searching on content of interest. In fact, Blue Sky has a free streaming API where you can literally stream all messages on Blue Sky, which sounds amazing, but as Blue Sky hopefully grows, that's going to become very overwhelming, and you're going to need to have some API that lets you be more selective, building filters, matching on hashtags or certain accounts. So yeah, it's still an interesting space for me. And another thing is what Twitter was amazing about Twitter compared to, say, like a Facebook, is just how real time it was.
Yeah.
And how, as a user, you had, and I don't know how this works today on Twitter, or on X, but the ability to affect your timeline and how things are brought into your world. Are they in chronological order? Is it driven by engagement? Is there some algorithm behind the scenes? I mean, that's one of the selling points of Blue Sky, is that you have, in theory, total control over the flow of new messages into your timeline. And that's key. If you're focused on real-time data coming from an event in your area, you need to have that capability.
Yeah, well, we saw the other thing that, of course, has happened on X is the pollution, the information pollution explosion. It's really hard. I have to work hard to be sure what I'm looking at is real. And like when Helene was unfolding, there was horrific examples of dangerous misuse of this platform. Discussion of bodies piled in the streets, and et cetera, et cetera. FEMA became dangerous to be a FEMA employee.
Yeah, that's
it's like actually acted in the opposite direction.
Right.
There's Twitter for good. It used to be a hashtag, right?
Yeah.
There was a time.
Yep. X for disinformation, if you want to do that. There's no guardrails anymore, really, on X.
Yeah. So then, maybe we'll just a few more minutes. We'll get at the idea of next steps. Certainly, one thing I've been pushing for generally for several years now is we need to have a much better capacity to assess bad outcomes in flash floods and other disasters. There's been calls for a national disaster review board or a safety board, just like we have one for aviation for decades, the National Transportation Safety Board. And there's a couple of people in Congress who are now starting to make some noise that there's interest in creating that. So you have a nonpartisan failure analysis, when you have 100+ deaths in a place in Texas that's fundamentally seen. Actually, I think it's like 1,500 deaths I can't remember the last number of decades. so we can have a cogent conversation about these things. You know, how much of it was failure at the last mile? We always hear about the last mile.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. And certainly here in the States, maybe we should learn more from Indonesia about WhatsApp. Because, and I just wanted to see if Andrew, maybe if you, when you look around, what do you see as next steps, given what has been unfolding so far, not just in Texas?
Yes, I think questions that I have that I've been thinking a lot about after the recent event in Texas is, well, the questions are related to the role of the perception of usefulness related to different types of technology. You know, we're hearing stories of like some areas having a siren system set up. You know, some people were using the NOAA weather radios. You know, other people were not using those. Questions I have include, like, to what extent is this the pursuit of having like the perfect app for all weather hazards? You know, this sense of having an AI driven, like, magical solution of like, oh, my phone will save me, you know, somehow leading to a deprioritization of some of the more traditional approaches of warnings. And I'm purposely avoiding using the phrase old fashioned. You know, I feel like that's if I wanted people to buy my weather app, I would totally frame those approaches as old fashioned. You know, what do you want, the old fashioned approach, or you want the new stuff? But I think the solution is likely to be more of a blend of the two. You know, in certain cases, I mean, yeah, like the sirens you're showing here. Like, I'm not a siren expert or like knowing the engineering that goes into this, but they work for certain types of hazards, sudden onset and localized hazard, for example, like a tornado, where you do have a limited lead time, and that should be explored further. Weather radios, I mean, there's a reason why they were developed. I mean, you don't need cell service. I mean, there might be some areas where you're not getting the signal of the weather radios, but my understanding is that those areas are far fewer than lacking cellular service. So I think being a bit more critical about blending, you know, the different types of technology. I mean, I would even go as far as to say, I mean, there've been flash floods in this area for hundreds of years, right?
Right.
To what extent would it be possible? Should we be challenging ourselves to, if we're talking about the integration of different types of technology, should that be extended to some of the indigenous approaches to understanding risk and anticipating and early warning? You know, I haven't really seen that element brought up in the past week. I think it's at least a question that we should be asking, and that is happening in other parts of the world. We are asking those sorts of questions. So yes, I think that those are some reflections that I've had. Something else to note, and I think this is an important element that also hasn't been coming up so much, is, I mean, what are the stories of the people living in the areas impacted by the floods? And I'm making a distinction between living and camping, or living and recreational use. Right? I think, I mean, I believe that part of the story will be part of the retrospective analysis. But I mean, to me, there's a difference between even unknowingly being located in a flood zone at a given time, or because of the way that housing prices people out. Certainly similar to what we saw in Ida here in New York, right? There's reasons why people are living in certain places, like living in the places, not going to. So I think these distinctions are very important to make when we're talking about the disproportionate impact. Like, certainly it was a terrible situation. I'm not trying to say that there's a difference in terms of who lost their life, but I think in terms of thinking about next steps, thinking about preventing this, there are differences, demographic differences, and we should be talking about that as well.
You're reminding me of a webcast I did with actually Deanne Criswell was on it, the Biden era FEMA director, and others, related to having kind of an education push at the community scale sort of like what the Great Shakeout has done for earthquakes. You know, in earthquake areas in California, every year, I think it's in October, there's a day where everyone drops and goes under a table or goes to a door. In Indonesia, I know for sure there must be general awareness of what to do in an earthquake, but we needed all hazards kind of assessment where imagine if every community once a year had a fair. In San Francisco, there's a guy who was doing this, where you just meet your neighbors, you get a sense of your hazard landscape, so that when a siren blows or when the forecast is looking like heavy rain and you're in an area that looks like this. This is a picture I grabbed from a video at the camp. Look at that erosion, the flood sculpted rock behind the campers. I mean, that says beware, right? But if you're not having an engaged conversation with your environment and your neighbors, you might miss that. So I think somehow or other that kind of education push could be helpful. I don't know if that makes sense. And maybe Nasheen, I don't know if this is part of Jakarta. Is, you know, flooding is so normalized that it's a little different in a way than these abrupt, urgent kind of situations. But is there a lot more general awareness there than we might think in other places?
Well, I mean, from the perspective of education, surprisingly, not like no formal training. I think the awareness comes out of the fact that people who live near the river, near the sea, or I mean, even us living in this, like in the middle of the city where it was flooding, we learned to read the indicators in our environment out of necessity. So even as a kid, there are all of these waterways that run through Jakarta, and we every time before, like as we were walking home in the rainy season, we would pay attention to how high has the water level reached and how quickly is it rising. And so these are things that we are attuned to looking out for out of necessity. But of course, flooding is happening in increasingly erratic ways now, and it's difficult to be able to anticipate in the same way that we could before. But I think it is this, what we try to harness is in Peta Bencana as well, is that people living in a place know it best. And we really need to allow for ways for that knowledge to be shared and amplified. And technology can be a way to do that. You know, like Andrew was talking about a blend, we can take local knowledge and find a way to amplify that as a warning system through technologies. And it's what we're trying to do with Peta Bencana, where every reporting mechanism we've devised, for example, for volcanoes, the communities living on the volcanoes can detect activity far quicker than any seismograph based on conditions of the plants or the soil or certain animal behaviors. And we integrate that into the reporting mechanism in Peta Bencana. And when they report now through WhatsApp, an automatic alert is sent out to everyone living in those areas in order to amplify that. And so I think that's one way we can leverage, is that people who've learned to read the environment, how can we amplify their warnings? And then we're all just going to have to become more massively attuned to reading the environment. I think our attention is continuously being diverted away from, the places we actually live. And we need to find ways to redirect that attention towards how do we learn to read signals that are all around us, exactly like the image you shared earlier.
That sounds so true. And Andrew, I remember in 2021, one of the conversations we were in was we talked about the historical streams that ran through Brooklyn and Queens, that underneath the streets, there's a landscape of water that reappears when there's a lot of rain. And that feels very much like attuned with what Nasheen was saying. Locally, or you can know locally if you're at higher risk or not, that kind of thing. Do you remember? I can't remember. You live in a section.
Yes, I remember. I mean, I'm under. This is our apartment in Gowanus, Brooklyn. Gowanus is a swamp,
right?
So I'm like literally on top of what we just described. But Yeah, I mean, but what is our responsibility to understand risk? Whose responsibility is it to ensure
Right.
that people understand risk? And then what are the limits to that? You know, what is the practicality of understanding your risk? Do I need to understand the risk like at every point along my commute to work every day? Do I need to understand risk whenever I go on vacation? Is it my responsibility to understand risk? It's really complicated. So many of the people in Texas were enjoying their vacations or holidays, whatever. I mean, these are questions that we still haven't sufficiently grappled with. I'm not even talking about how risk is changing over time. I'm just talking about now. You know, we have the data is available. How do we translate it in a way, and whose responsibility is to do that translation? You know, these are very complicated questions that, in my opinion, I mean, we've had such a push of better technology, higher spatial resolution forecasts, more specific, maybe you could call it at least representations of risk, but to what extent has that led to improved translating of that risk and understanding and the cognitive elements of that risk? Like there's so much more that we need to do before we have a new shiny app that's just giving me a cool map to look at.
That sounds like a really important point, and it's a call to action that we're at the early days of understanding how to pull this all together, including the social media elements, the bespoke last mile and last half mile of the chain from information to action, and the basic education is sort of some call it there was this thing called pre-bunking during the COVID days of giving people information ahead of time about vaccines or the like, so that they're less likely to be misled. But just presaging, pre envisioning, maybe building into the summer camp experience, the geological and hydrological history of where you're camping. You know, normalizing that all the way around and then funding the basic science and technology, and having more open data, right, Jim? I think, you know, open data, open source work like Nashin is doing.
Yeah.
Those are all vital parts of this going forward. Maybe Jim and Nashin, any last words from you, and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, I think we have a consensus here that effective flood warning has to be a blend of old-fashioned and modern technology. And it'll just be interesting to see, you know, will there be a new emphasis on putting in these siren-based systems that for that last half a mile, you know? What role, like so many things around weather, will the insurance industry play? Like if you have a summer camp, are you going to need to rethink how you would notify people without phones in the middle of the night? I mean, that was the tragic perfect storm of what happened in Texas.
Yeah. And by the way, the one element I would add is making sure you have an all hazards mindset, because I'm going to be doing a show on tornado warnings, and this kind of hyperlocal flood warning are very similar challenges, including the challenge of complacency. Right. If the tornado doesn't hit you, does that mean it was a false alarm? No.
Yeah. Right.
So there's lots to do. This is Andy Revkin. This is the Sustain What webcast, girdling the globe, in this case, from Indonesia to the United States, to Brooklyn, and to Colorado, and the state of Maine, where I'm coming from. And I really appreciate my guests coming on today. Jim Moffitt, former Twitter engineer, evangelist for open access to data to reduce disasters. Andrew Krushevitz, Columbia Climate School, working really hard on making warnings work. And Nashin Matani at Petabenkana ID in Indonesia. Thank you so much for doing this. We talked about this for months, if not years, I think. And let's consider it sort of part one. Okay. We can get back to it. Thanks everybody. As soon as we're done, you can share the video, the archive video, with anyone, anywhere, and stay in touch. This is Sustain What.
All right. Thank you. Good to see you all.